Al Capone. I mean, just saying the name, you already know, right? It
Yeah.
brings up a lot, right? Not just, the myth movies like Scarface, but a real piece, like a real chunk of American history. And you sent in some really interesting stuff. You sent us a bunch of different sources on him, everything from like the big Wikipedia deep dive that they've got to the PBS American Experience thing that they did that focuses on his Miami years, and then even some stuff from like Wyoming public media that digs into like the whole Public Enemy #1 thing, and Oblong Media Unlimited, which kind of goes into his whole rise in the world he was in. So it's pretty clear to me that you want to understand like who was this guy, right? Beyond the myth. Forget Scarface for a second, right? Let's just go deep into who this guy was, where he came from, how he built his empire in Chicago, what brought him down, in the end, and then like even those kind of sad last few years.
Yeah, it's amazing when you look at uh, Capone's beginnings. It's not like he was like this overnight like Chicago gangster. What we're seeing in all this stuff is actually a really specific early life. Like he's born Alphonse Gabriel Capone in Brooklyn, in New York City, back in January 1899, and his parents, Gabriella and Teresa, they're Italian immigrants. They came from like the Naples area, and they made their way to the U.S. in 1893. And get this, they even like spent a little time in Fiume, which is now Rijeka in Croatia, before they finally ended up in Brooklyn. So
Yeah.
it really is like a classic immigrant story,
Yeah.
like family trying to build a new life in America.
And it wasn't just him, right? He wasn't alone in all this. Wikipedia tells us he was like one of 8 kids, right? 8 siblings. And some of them, kind of crossed paths with his later life in some really, really strange ways. Think about James Vincenzo Capone, who actually like later on became Richard Hart, a prohibition agent. Can you believe that?
Yeah, his own brother, enforcing prohibition, and then there's Ralph, who like managed the beverage side of the whole operation, and Salvatore Frank, who worked in the whole empire early on before he died. I mean, it gives you a real sense of the whole like family dynamic going on, and how like totally different paths came out of like the same background, the same place.
Totally. And as he's growing up in Brooklyn, these sources, they point to some like key early things that influence him. He got involved with the 5 Points gang
Yeah.
as a teenager, which is like, early exposure to organized crime. And interestingly, a lot of the sources like Wikipedia and Oblong Media, they talk about his time as a bouncer in different places,
Yeah.
and they suggest that like that's probably where he got syphilis, and the fact that according to this stuff, he knew he was infected but didn't try to get treatment. That's a pretty big deal when you think about what happened to him later.
Yeah. And then of course there's the whole story behind the nickname Scarface, right? Both Wikipedia and Oblong Media talk about this slashing that happened at a dance with a guy named Frank Galluccio. And what's so interesting is that like Wikipedia says that Capone himself, like he didn't like that nickname. He hated it. So it kind of like makes you think about like his public image versus like, who he saw himself as, right? And then there's this other little fact like that he played like some semi-pro baseball in Brooklyn. It almost makes you wonder, what could have happened if things had gone differently,
Right.
like, different path entirely.
Sure.
Right.
Like all these different paths he could have taken, right? And it really makes you think about like the choices and the circumstances that put him on this particular path. And the move to Chicago in 1919, he was invited by Johnny Torrio, who was the enforcer for Big Jim Colosimo. And that was a major turning point for him. And he started out as a bouncer again, this time in a brothel. And the Oblong Media source, they make a really big point about how suspicious Capone's involvement in Colosimo's murder was in May 1920, and it was likely like ordered by Torrio. So that event basically it cleared the way for Torrio and then obviously Capone to kind of rise to the top. And it wasn't a gentle rise.
No, no, it wasn't. And the sources show how fast everything happened, by the early 20s, Wikipedia says his name was even like popping up in newspaper sports sections as a boxing promoter.
Right.
It's almost like this legitimate thing, but it was probably like covering up other things he was doing. In 1923, he bought a house on South Prairie Avenue. Like that's a real sign of success.
Yeah.
You buy a house, but the real change, the real power shift came after Torrio got shot in January 1925. He lived, but he decided to retire. So he basically handed the whole everything, the whole thing over to Capone. And Capone Capone was only 26 at the time. I mean, that's a lot of power and responsibility for someone that young, you know.
Yeah. It's a lot, you know. And under Capone, like the organization, they expanded, they consolidated their control, and the illegal breweries and that whole bootlegging network all the way up to Canada, it became incredibly lucrative. Like all the different sources, they confirm that. But what's really important is that they also had protection from politicians and law enforcement, right? Wikipedia and the PBS thing, they highlight these kind of mutually profitable relationships with people like Mayor William Hill Thompson and people in the Chicago PD. So this let his whole operation just like flourish. Like he was practically unstoppable. You really have to think about like how bad the corruption was for all of that to be happening.
And to keep that power, right, and to make it even bigger, the sources make it really clear. Capone was ruthless. He was brutal. Wikipedia says he was systematically bombing places that wouldn't buy from him. Like they say, maybe 100 bombings throughout the 20s. It's crazy. And his rivals, they accused him of making prostitution worse. You know, he even like strategically set up shop in Cicero, Illinois, and he used, you know, bribes and threats to control the local elections there. He was creating like a buffer zone against his north side rivals. Like he was always thinking ahead, always thinking about the next move. And Oblong Media, they paint this picture of a guy who just like wanted women, money, and power. You know, he's living this lavish lifestyle, being this super visible symbol of his success.
Yeah, and the feud with the Aiello brothers, which went on, you know, from 1925 to 1930, that's a really clear example of how ruthless he was. You know, it started after Antonio Lombardo, who was Capone's consigliere. He became the head of the Unia Siciliana, and that was a job that Joe Aiello really, really wanted. And Wikipedia goes into detail about how resentful Aiello was and how he teamed up with Capone's enemies, like Jack Suda. So, you know, it really shows you how complex and violent these power struggles were in organized crime at that time.
I mean, it's wild. Like the lengths they went to, it's unbelievable. Wikipedia talks about multiple attempts to kill Capone. Like Aiello was behind it, and one of them was almost like poison soup. Like they bribed the chef, but Capone got tipped off, and then Capone's revenge, like he supposedly like sprayed Aiello's bakery with something like 200 bullets. I mean, come on, it's crazy. And then the bounty, Aiello put a $50,000 bounty on Capone, and Wikipedia says like at least 10 hitmen tried and failed, you know, and a lot of them ended up dead themselves. And then you've got Ralph Sheldon, one of Capone's own guys, tried to betray him for the money and ended up getting shot. It's just like, you know, you couldn't trust anyone in that world, obviously.
No, absolutely not. Aiello, you know, he was determined. Even after he ran off to Trenton, New Jersey, he kept plotting against Capone. But like both Wikipedia and Oblong Media say, you know, the feud ended in this brutal ambush in October 1930. Aiello got gunned down when he was leaving an apartment building, and there were like multiple gunmen with submachine guns, you know, all set up, ready to go. It was a real show of force. And Capone, he eliminated his rivals. It didn't matter where they went, you know.
And it wasn't just like those internal gang wars, right? The sources also talk about how Capone was like really deep in the political scene, and there was like a ton of violence that came with it. You know, Wikipedia talks about this horrible Pineapple primary bombing in April 1928. It was linked to Capone's bomber, James Bill Castro, and at least 15 people died at voting booths. I mean, can you imagine? And then there's the murder of a lawyer, Octavius Granati, on election day. He was going up against Mayor Thompson's candidate. And again, you know, they think Bill Castro was involved. And then a New York Times article from 29 that's mentioned in Wikipedia, it even links Capone to earlier murders, like his old mentor, Frankie Yale. So it's pretty clear, like organized crime was manipulating the political system. They were terrorizing people.
And of course, we can't talk about Capone without talking about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Of course not. February 14th, 1929.
Valentine's Day, 1929. Both Wikipedia and the PBS documentary, they really highlight how big this event was, right? The 7 members of the North Side Gang, Capone's rivals, they were murdered in broad daylight, and the gunmen were dressed as police officers. So that shocked the whole country. And even though Capone was in Miami at the time, he was actually being questioned about another murder down there. The public, they were outraged, you know. And Wikipedia and Wyoming Public Media, they point out how newspapers immediately labeled him public enemy #1. And that event, even though he wasn't actually there, it really messed up his image. And the PBS thing, it mentions how he hired a press agent to try to like manage all the bad press.
Yeah. And it seems like that massacre was really the turning point. You know, it really put the pressure on. Like the public was demanding something be done, and the government was, they had to do something. And Wikipedia talks about how Walter A. Strong, who was the publisher of the Chicago Daily News, he actually like went right to President Hoover and said, you got to do something. You got to intervene. And Hoover, according to his memoirs, which Wikipedia cites, he responded by saying, okay, all federal agencies, you're focusing on Capone now, you're going after this guy. That was a big, big change. Like, they were finally serious about taking him down.
And this federal intervention, it took a few different forms. Wikipedia talks about how the Treasury and Justice Departments, they started building income tax evasion cases against him, which was like a pretty new legal strategy at the time. And then, of course, there's the famous Eliot Ness and his Untouchables. They were this dedicated group of Prohibition Bureau agents, and they were just like laser focused on shutting down Capone's alcohol operations. And the PBS account really, really goes into like how relentless Ness was.
And then all the legal battles started, right? It's kind of crazy. Wikipedia says he was arrested for contempt of court in March 1929, and then he was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon, and he got a year in prison for that. So it's kind of weird that he ended up doing time for something that's like, relatively minor compared to like all the violence he's accused of. And the Oblong Media piece, it even kind of hints that maybe Capone thought this was a good way to like, lay low for a while things were getting, too hot.
Right. Maybe he thought, oh, I'll just hide out in prison for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of why he did it, that year in Eastern State Penitentiary didn't stop the feds from investigating him. And Wikipedia talks about how U.S. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willard-Brandt, she was really important in using this tax evasion thing against rich criminals. And in 1927, the Supreme Court, they ruled, in this case, United States v. Sullivan, that money made illegally, it's still taxable income. So that became the whole basis for taking Capone down.
And the evidence they got was huge. Wikipedia talks about how Capone's own lawyer, he basically admitted how much money Capone was making during some early talks about taxes. Like, he admitted Capone made a lot of money in 28 and 29. So even though they didn't have, like, exact records of his illegal businesses, they had his representative saying, yeah, he made a ton of money and he didn't pay taxes on it. So that led to him being indicted in June 1931 on, like, a bunch of counts of tax evasion and then like a crazy amount of Volstead Act violations. I mean, they were throwing the book at him.
Yeah.
They were not messing around. And the trial, it was huge. It was all over the news, And Wikipedia tells us that on October 17th, 1931, Al Capone, he's found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. And he's sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. And he has to pay huge fines. And then he tried to appeal, and it failed. I mean, it's kind of amazing, right? The guy who built this whole empire on violence and intimidation, he gets taken down by taxes. It really shows you how creative like law enforcement had to be to get him.
Totally. And being in prison, it was like a total 180 from his life outside, right? He was in Atlanta for a while, and then he was transferred to Alcatraz. And Wikipedia says that at first he was like, a model prisoner, but then his health started to go downhill because of the neurosyphilis. He'd had it for years. And the PBS documentary, it talks about how his mental state was already declining in 38. It's almost like, it's sad, but it's also ironic, right? This disease that he ignored, it's the thing that brings him down in the end.
Yeah. It's kind of tragic how it all played out, The neurosyphilis just got worse and worse, and Wikipedia goes into all the details of how he was getting weaker and weaker, and finally he's released from prison in November 1939. But it's only because he's really, really sick. They sent him to Johns Hopkins Hospital, but because he's Al Capone, they wouldn't give him long-term care. So then he ends up at Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore, and this is kind of a surprise, but he actually donated cherry trees to the hospital. It's kind of a weird, like, nice gesture from Al Capone. And then in 1946, Wikipedia says, doctors like, yeah, his mind is basically like a 12-year-old now.
Oh, wow. And then he spends his last few years back at his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. He's got his wife, his grandkids with him. It's a pretty sad picture. It's so different from the ruthless guy who was like in charge of Chicago. And Wikipedia mentions that he was like one of the first people to be treated with penicillin in 42. And that might have slowed down the syphilis, but it couldn't fix the damage to his brain. And then in January 1947, he has a stroke, gets pneumonia, and then a few days later, he dies of a heart attack. He was 48.
Yeah.
And they buried him in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Illinois. It's kind of a sad end to a really, wild life.
Yeah. And throughout his whole career, Capone, he really worked on his public image. both Wikipedia and Wyoming Public Media, they talk about this. Seems like he liked the attention. Even did some charity stuff, like donated to soup kitchens during the Depression. And that made some people think he was like a modern-day Robin Hood, which is crazy. Wikipedia even mentions that. And there's that famous quote, "I'm just a businessman giving people what they want." It's in like all the sources. And it really shows you how like he built this persona for himself. It's a fascinating, example of someone trying to control how people saw him, even though, he was doing all these terrible things.
Yeah, but the PBS documentary makes it clear that not everyone was buying it, right? Like people in Miami Beach, they thought he was bad for their count. And even after prison, when he was trying to fix his image with these Goodwill dinners in Miami, it didn't really work. So it's like the fame he wanted, the notoriety, it came back to bite him. It brought all that attention from the feds, and that's what took him down in the end. It's kind of a lesson about how tricky public image can be.
And even now, all these years later, his name, his image, it's still everywhere. In movies, in TV, in books.
Yeah.
Wikipedia and Wyoming Public Media, they both talk about that. And his family even trying to sue people over how he was portrayed in the media, but they didn't win. It just shows you how much people are still interested in this guy, in this whole era. And it's interesting, a few of the sources mention that his brother, James Vincenzo Capone, he changed his name to Richard Hart. Like he wanted to get as far away from the Capone name as he could.
Yeah. So, we've really gone deep into Al Capone's life, and it's clear that the real story is way more complicated, way more tragic than just that Scarface myth, right? He went from being an immigrant kid to being this powerful, violent crime boss, and then he gets taken down by the system he was exploiting and this disease he just ignored. It's kind of a wild ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And all these sources, they paint this picture of someone who, he was chasing the American dream, but in this really messed up way. He was brutal. He was breaking the law. And in the end, he became a symbol of like the dark side of prohibition. And it's a warning. It shows what can happen when someone has too much power and no one stops them.
Yeah, and it makes you think, right? How did his image, how did this weird mix of being this scary gangster, but also this guy who some people thought was doing good, how did that help him get to the top? And how did it lead to his downfall? What does his story, like the whole complicated thing, what does it tell us about fame and infamy and about what happens when people chase power? It's something to think about, something to really ponder.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
A lot to unpack.
A lot there.